The archive is open. Come in out of the cold. Your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I've pulled something old from the shelves, older than most things in this room, ancient Egypt, the whole long story of it, told slowly, from the first flood to the last pharaoh. You don't need to remember any of this. There's no test at the end. If you drift, I'll keep reading. Let's begin. Start with the land itself, because Egypt is really a story about a river before it is a story about anyone at all. On either side of that river, the ground is desert, pale, dry, empty of almost everything. Walk a few miles from the water in most places and the world simply stops being able to feed you. No grain, no reeds for baskets, no mud to build a wall with. So for thousands of years, life in Egypt did not spread out the way it might elsewhere. It queued up in a long green line a few miles wide at most, following the one source of water that never quite failed. That river is the Nile, and it kept a schedule. Once a year, water rose far to the south, swelled with rain that fell on mountains most Egyptians never saw, and traveled north for months until it reached their fields and quietly climbed the banks. It was not a flood in the way we usually mean the word, not a wall of water arriving without warning. It came the same season, most years, gently enough that farmers could watch it rise a hand's width at a time. Imagine, if you like, a season you could set your plans by as easily as the turning of leaves, plant here, wait here, harvest there, because the water told you when. Compare that for a moment to the rivers of Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, which historians often set beside the Nile precisely because they were so different. Those rivers could rise without warning and tear through a season's planting in a single night. The Nile rarely did that. It rose, it settled, it withdrew, leaving the land better than it found it. A river you could trust is a rare enough thing that it shapes everything built around it. The crops, the calendar, even the temperament of the people who write about their gods. And when the water withdrew each year, it left something behind, a fine, dark silt carried down from far upriver and laid across the fields like a blanket. This soil was rich and black, and it made growing food possible in the middle of a desert that otherwise offered nothing. The Egyptians noticed this so clearly that they named their whole country after it. They called their land Kemet, the Black Land, for that dark, fertile mud along the river. Everything beyond it, the dry sand stretching to the horizon on both sides, they called the Red Land. Two colors, one river between them, and a whole civilization pressed into the narrow black ribbon where the two met. So before there were kings, or writing, or temples, there was this arrangement, a river that flooded on schedule, a strip of black earth a few miles wide, and a desert that made clear, without needing to say so, where life was possible and where it was not. The Nile was calendar, road, and provider all at once, and nothing that came later in this story, no crown, no pyramid, no god with a falcon's head, would have existed without it. Boats moved on it before roads existed to compete with them, carrying grain, stone, and eventually whole temples in pieces from one town to the next, since hauling goods through sand was slower and harder on the feet than letting the current do the work. Farmers timed their planting by its rise the way people elsewhere might time planting by the moon. And when Egyptians imagined their gods, more than one took the shape of the river's moods. A god of the flood itself fed offerings each year in the hope the water would rise exactly enough, and no more. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Along the riverbanks, farmers cut small notches into stones to mark the height of each year's flood, a thin line scratched at the water's highest reach, no wider than a thumb. Some of these stones held 100 years of notches, stacked one above another, a family's whole memory of the river kept not in words, but in marks pressed into rock. Each one a year someone stood at the water's edge and watched it rise. For a long stretch of Egypt's earliest history, there was no single Egypt at all. There were two lands strung along that same green ribbon of river, and they thought of themselves as quite separate places, with different towns, different local gods, and different customs for something as ordinary as burying the dead. Upper Egypt lay to the south, upstream, where the land rose gently toward the river's distant source, and the valley narrowed to a strip you could sometimes walk across in an afternoon. Lower Egypt lay to the north, downstream, where the Nile finally spread wide into a marshy delta of reeds and shallow channels before reaching the sea. Those names trip people up now because we tend to think of maps with north at the top and assume upper must mean higher on the page. But the Egyptians were not naming their country by a map. They were naming it by the river. Upper Egypt was upriver, toward the water's source. Lower Egypt was lower down the river's course, near where it finally let go and met the sea. The land followed the water, and so did the names. Each of these two lands had its own crown, and the crowns themselves are worth picturing clearly, because Egyptians would keep drawing and carving them for the next 3,000 years. The south wore a tall white crown, shaped a little like a bowling pin, simple and upright. The north wore a low red crown, flatter, with a curling wire rising from the back of it like a plant, sending up a single shoot. Two lands, two shapes of headwear, two separate kingdoms living along the same river without yet sharing a ruler. About 5,000 years ago, something changed. A king from the south, most historians point to a ruler named Nama, though the evidence from this period is thin and scholars still argue about names and order quietly, the way people argue about old family stories, moved north and brought the two lands under one rule. From that point on, kings of Egypt wore both crowns together, the white crown of the south nested inside the red crown of the north, one sitting snugly within the other, as if to say plainly, both lands, one head. What survives from that moment of joining is a single carved stone slab, a little over 2 feet tall, known now as the Nama pallet. On it, a king wearing first one crown and then the other strikes down enemies, receives offerings, and presides over a kingdom shown for the first time as one thing rather than two. Historians treat it carefully. It is more a piece of royal storytelling than a photograph of a single afternoon, but it remains one of the oldest images we have of a ruler claiming to hold both halves of Egypt at once. From that joining onward, Egypt would exist as one kingdom for most of the next 3,000 years, with gaps here and there when the two lands drifted apart again before being stitched back together, usually around some trouble with the flood itself. A run of poor years on the river tended to loosen a kingdom's grip on its own edges. 3,000 years is longer than the whole span of ancient Rome, longer than nearly any political idea humans have managed to hold onto without it eventually breaking apart for good. It began, as far as we can tell, with a king from upriver deciding that one crown should rest quietly inside another, and it would end only when a river of a different sort, the flow of empires, Greek, and then Roman, finally overtook it. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. That carved stone slab, the Nama palette, often called history's first political document, was shaped, at its heart, from an object every Egyptian household would have recognized. A palette for grinding cosmetics, the kind used to mix the dark eye paint people wore every day along the river. The record of a kingdom's birth, carved with such care and studied for thousands of years since, takes the exact form of a dish for mixing makeup. Once Egypt was one kingdom, its kings needed somewhere to be buried that matched the size of what they believed about themselves. And so, a few centuries after the two lands joined, Egyptians began building pyramids, shapes that still, all these years later, stop people mid-sentence when they come around a bend and see one for the first time. Nobody can say with total certainty why the shape itself was chosen, and historians hold more than one idea gently, side by side. Some think of it as a staircase, a set of steps the king's spirit could climb toward the sky. Others think of the sloping sides as sunlight itself, turned to stone, the sun's rays, frozen at the angle they fall at dawn. Either way, the pyramid was an attempt to build a shape that would not decay the way a house or a body does. A shape built to outlast weather, outlast memory, outlast almost anything. The first true pyramid belongs to a king named Djoser, whose name is said Joh, and to his architect, a man named Imhotep, said Imhoshotep. Imhotep's idea, as far as we can tell from what remains at his building site, was almost playful in its simplicity. Stack one flat-topped tomb on top of a slightly smaller one, and then another smaller one on top of that, 6 layers in all, like nested boxes rising in steps toward the sky. It was the first building of its kind, and it set the whole idea in motion. A few generations later, at a place called Giza, the shape smoothed out into the true pyramid most people picture now, with flat triangular sides instead of steps. The largest of these belonged to a king named Khufu, said Khufu, and when it was finished, it was the tallest structure human hands had built anywhere on Earth. It held that record for nearly 4,000 years, longer than almost any building has held any record before or since. As for how it was built, the honest answer is gentler and more human than the old picture of endless suffering under the whip. These were not slaves in the way that word is often imagined. The workers were largely farmers, called up in seasonal crews during the months each year when the Nile's flood covered their fields and there was no planting to be done anyway. In other words, the same river that fed the kingdom also freed its hands for a few months, and a pharaoh with a building to raise knew exactly when to ask for them. The crews were paid in bread and beer, housed in a nearby workers' town that has since been uncovered by archaeologists, complete with bakeries, kitchens, sleeping quarters arranged in rows, and even a doctor's quarters for treating the inevitable aches and broken toes of hauling stone all day. It was hard, exhausting, seasonal labor, done shoulder to shoulder with neighbors from your own village. But it was closer to a rotating national project, something closer to a harvest than a punishment. The stones themselves moved on wooden sledges, dragged up ramps whose exact shape and path historians still argue about, quietly, since no ramp has ever been found intact. Workers likely poured water onto the sand ahead of the sledges, since wet sand offers less resistance than dry, letting heavy loads slide with less strain than you might expect. And when the stones were finally set in place, the precision was almost unsettling. The pyramid's sides aligned to the compass points with an accuracy modern surveyors respect, and the seams between blocks are often tight enough to trouble the edge of a knife blade. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Deep inside the pyramid, on blocks that no visitor was ever meant to see again once construction finished, the work crews scratched their own names into the stone, small, informal, proud. One crew called itself Friends of Khufu. 5,000 years later, that graffiti is still there in the dark, a signature left in a hidden place, the way a person might carve initials into the underside of a drawer where only they would ever know to look. Set the kings aside for a night and look instead at a house. Not a palace, not a tomb built to outlast the sky, just a house, the kind that stood in the hundreds along the Black Land, walls raised from mud brick, thick and plain, made by packing river mud into wooden molds and leaving it to dry in the sun. Mud brick has a quiet virtue that outlasts fashion. It holds the day's heat and gives it back slowly, so a room that was baking at noon turns almost cool by the time the household settles for the evening. Inside, the walls were often whitewashed, a pale coat over the brown, which caught what little lamplight there was and spread it gently across the room. In high summer, many families didn't sleep inside those walls at all. They carried their bedding up a short stair to the flat roof, laid it out under the open sky, and slept there instead, where the air moved and the day's stored heat couldn't follow them. It is worth pausing on that image. A whole household, quilts and mats gathered under an arm, climbing to the roof together as the light failed, the way we might carry a blanket out to a porch on the one night of the year it's finally cool enough to sit outside. Supper came first, and it rested on two staples that appeared at nearly every table along the river. Bread, baked from wheat or barley, sometimes gritty with sand that had worked its way in from the grinding stone. And beer, though the word undersells it. Egyptian beer was thick, closer to a porridge than to anything poured from a bottle today, and it was drunk through a hollow reed, sipped slowly to strain out the grains still floating in it. Alongside these, whatever the season and the river had provided: onions, fish pulled fresh from the Nile that same afternoon, and on a fortunate day, dates or a spoonful of honey, sweetness being rare enough that it was noticed and remembered. After dark, light came from small oil lamps, a twist of linen laid in a shallow saucer of animal fat, burning low and a little smoky, enough to see a face across a room, but not much further. By that soft light, people played Senet, a board game of 30 squares that appears in tomb paintings and in the houses of the living alike. We have the board and the pieces from many burials, but the exact rules have slipped from us over the centuries. Historians can reconstruct an outline, a probable path across the squares, but not the whole of how it was won or lost. Somewhere in every game, chance and skill wrestled quietly by lamplight, and no one remains who remembers who was winning. Down in the storerooms, where the household kept its grain against the year ahead, cats were welcome and more than welcome. They were honored in their modest way because they kept the mice and rats from the harvest that a family's whole winter depended on. A full granary was a kind of wealth, and a cat patrolling it at night was doing work as real as any farmhands, even if no one thought to write it down as labor. People dressed in linen, plain and pale, made from the flax that grew in the same fields the river fed, and they went to some trouble to keep it white, beaten clean at the water's edge, laid out to dry and bleach further under the sun. Even that in its way traced back to the river, the flax that made the cloth, the water that washed it, the sun that the whole climate depended on to dry anything at all. The rhythm of the house, when to sleep, when to eat, what there was to eat, even what you wore and how you kept it clean, was set, in the end, by the water outside the door. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Egyptians did not sleep on pillows the way we do. They rested their heads on carved wooden headrests, shaped like a shallow crescent balanced on a short column, with a base to keep it steady on the sleeping mat. It looks, to modern eyes, like the least comfortable object imaginable to lay a head on through the night. But in that climate, it served a purpose a soft pillow never could. It lifted the sleeper's head just clear of the mat and into the cooler air moving above it. Comfort, in a hot country, did not mean softness. It meant a breeze finding your neck in the dark. Leave the house for a moment, but not the household, because the gods the Egyptians lived alongside were not confined to any distant temple. Religion, for most people, was not shaped like a single morning set aside each week. It was woven through the ordinary hours, and it lived in the house as much as anywhere else. Small gods watched over small rooms. Bes was one of the most loved of them, a stubby, bow-legged figure with a wide, grinning face, more comic than grand, and he was trusted to guard sleepers and children through the night, standing between them and whatever might otherwise trouble their rest. Beside him stood Taweret, a goddess shaped like a hippopotamus, standing upright, heavy and solid, and entirely unafraid, who watched over mothers and the safety of childbirth. These were not gods you visited. They were gods who lived with you, carved into the objects nearest your body while you slept. The great temples, the ones whose stone columns still stand along the river today, worked on an entirely different scale and toward an entirely different purpose. They were not built for crowds of worshippers gathering to sing or pray together, the way we might imagine a church. Ordinary people rarely passed through their inner doors at all. A temple functioned instead as something closer to an engine of maintenance, a place where priests woke the god's statue each morning, washed it, dressed it in fresh linen, set food before it, and returned in the evening to do it again. The point was not spectacle. The point was upkeep, the same patient upkeep you'd give a lamp that must never be allowed to run dry, because the Egyptians believed the gods' daily care was part of what kept the world itself running on schedule. The sun rising, the flood returning on its usual season, the whole order of things holding together one more day. It is not so different, in spirit, from the notches farmers once cut into riverside stones to track the flood's height, year after year. A quiet, unglamorous discipline practiced so that the larger rhythm of the world would not be left to chance. And the sky above all of it had its own quiet story. The goddess Nut, a name that rhymes with boot, was imagined as arching over the earth, her body forming the vault of heaven itself. Each evening she swallowed the sun, and each dawn she gave birth to it again, so that night was understood not as an absence of light, but as a passage through the inside of a living body. The stars scattered across her were lamps hung along that dark interior, small fixed points of light guiding anyone who traveled through the night, whether god or ordinary soul. That image was not confined to hymns and stories. Painters carried it directly onto the ceilings of tombs, coating the stone a deep, even blue and scattering it with 5-pointed yellow stars, so that a person laid to rest beneath one of those ceilings was, in a small and literal way, tucked under the same night sky the living slept beneath, just made permanent in paint instead of passing with the hours. And the dead themselves were imagined as travelers still, boarding boats each night to sail across that painted sky, the way the living sailed the river itself by day, one more crossing, on one more kind of water. Imagine, if you like, lying back and knowing the dark above you was not empty, but inhabited, a body, a river of stars, a boat somewhere within it carrying someone you had once known. It is a gentler way to hold the night than simply calling it absence. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Bess, the small grinning guardian of rest, was not only painted on walls or kept as a charm in a pocket. He was carved directly into the furniture people slept on, into the legs of beds, into the very headrests that lifted a sleeper's neck into the cool air. A small god, permanently stationed at the pillow, keeping watch over whatever passed through the mind in the dark. Egyptian beds, in their own modest way, came with their own bodyguards. Move the story forward now to a stretch of years historians often call Egypt's High Summer, the New Kingdom, roughly 3,500 years ago, when the Black Land along the river reached its widest wealth and its widest reach. It opens with a woman named Hatshepsut, who did something few before her had done. She ruled not as a queen standing beside a king, but as pharaoh outright, taking the full titles and the full authority of the throne. Under her, Egypt sent a trading fleet south, down the river, and along the coast, to a place the Egyptians called Punt, whose exact location historians still debate gently among themselves, somewhere along the shores of the Red Sea. The fleet came home laden with gold and ebony, and with something rarer than either, living myrrh trees, their roots wrapped carefully in baskets to keep them alive through the whole journey home, so they could be planted in the courtyards of her temple, where a visitor could stand among trees that had crossed a sea to be there. After her came Thutmose III, under whom Egypt's reach stretched wider than it ever had before, its influence and its armies extending north into lands well beyond the river's own valley. Then, a little later, Amenhotep III presided over a court so wealthy it seemed almost to glitter on its own. A king who commissioned statues by the hundred, some of them taller than any building nearby, and who once had an entire pleasure lake dug fresh from the earth as a gift for his queen, a private stretch of still water where a garden had stood before. Then came a strange interlude, brief and unlike anything before or after it. A king took the name Akhenaten and turned the whole religious life of the country toward a single god, the disk of the sun itself, worshipped almost alone, where before there had been a crowded household of gods, much like the small ones watching over ordinary bedrooms. He built an entirely new capital out in the desert, a city raised from nothing to house this new devotion. And when he was gone, the old gods simply came back, restored to their temples and their daily washing and dressing, as though the country had quietly and deliberately set the whole episode aside, the way you might wake from an unusual dream and without much discussion, return to your ordinary morning. One of the kings who followed him is now the most famous name from this whole stretch of centuries, and mostly by an accident of luck rather than any great deed of his own. Tutankhamun was young when he died, and his reign left little mark on the larger history of the empire. What made him known to us, nearly unchanged since his own burial, was simply that his tomb's door went undisturbed by robbers for over 3,000 years, while grander kings nearby had their tombs emptied not long after they were sealed. A small king, remembered largely because a door happened to stay shut. The span closes, more or less, with Rameses II, who held the throne for 66 years, a reign so long that most of his subjects would have known no other king in their lifetimes. Early in his reign, he fought a great battle at a place called Kadesh, up along the northern edge of Egypt's influence, against the kingdom of the Hittites. It was fierce and costly, and by most honest readings, ended without a clear winner on either side. What came after the battle matters more than the battle itself. Years later, the two kingdoms sat down and signed a peace, one of the earliest such agreements we have any record of at all, each side setting down in writing that the fighting was finished. Imagine, if you like, two kingdoms who had tried war and found it settled nothing, choosing afterward to write the ending down instead, so that neither side could later claim to remember it differently. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. That treaty between Egypt and the Hittites was carved twice, once in each kingdom's own language and set up in each kingdom's own capital, so that neither side could quietly alter its terms once the other had gone home. A copy of that same text, cast long afterward, hangs today in the halls of the United Nations in New York, a plain reminder that this is the oldest handshake we still have in writing, made between two powers who had already tried everything else. In a land where most people worked the same black soil their families had worked for generations, there was one path that led somewhere else entirely, and it began with a reed pen. To become a scribe, someone trained to read and write the elaborate picture signs we now call hieroglyphs, and the quicker cursive script used for everyday business, was to step onto the only real ladder Egypt offered. A farmer's son was almost certainly going to be a farmer. A soldier's path was hard and its rewards uncertain, since campaigns end and bodies wear out. But a scribe's son, if he learned his letters well, might rise to manage a temple's grain stores or a governor's household, or in rare cases, the affairs of the whole kingdom. One old piece of schoolroom advice, copied and recopied by students for centuries, put it almost bluntly. Be a scribe, it said, for the scribe is spared hard labor. The learning itself was neither quick nor gentle. Boys began young, often around the age of 5, and spent years in temple schools copying the same respected texts over and over, first onto flakes of limestone or broken bits of pottery, cheap and disposable, before ever touching the real material. Teachers favored proverbs about diligence, and were not shy about proverbs concerning idle students either. Surviving schoolwork includes lines grumbling about boys who would rather play than practice their signs, which is a complaint that has apparently not changed in 3,000 years. A student's hand cramped, his eyes tired in the lamplight, and he copied anyway because the copying was the whole of the training. There was no shortcut to fluency in several hundred signs. Once a scribe had earned the right to use it, his pages were made from the plant that had shaped every part of this story already. Papyrus reeds, cut from the shallow marshes along the river, were sliced into thin strips, laid side by side, then pressed crosswise with a second layer on top, and left to dry under weight until the plant's own sap glued the whole sheet into one smooth surface. The river had already given Egypt its calendar and its harvest. Now, sliced and pressed and dried, it gave Egypt its paper too. And here is the quiet gift of all that training, because writing became so ordinary a skill among a certain class of people. What survives from ancient Egypt is not only royal proclamation and temple hymn, but the completely unglamorous residue of daily life. Letters complaining that a grain shipment arrived short, receipts for beer and bread, tallied and filed. A boy's excuse in his own hand for missing a day of lessons. Love poetry that reads as fresh now as anything written since. One poem describes the heart at the sight of a beloved as fluttering like a bird, an image so natural that later poets in other languages would reach for it too, though the Egyptians reached first. None of these documents were written for us. They were written for a grain officer or a teacher or a person the writer was hoping to impress, and then folded away and forgotten. 3,000 years later, we open them anyway and read, in effect, a stranger's ordinary bad day or a stranger's small triumph, exactly as it was felt at the time. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In museum cases today, the wooden pallets that scribes carried still hold 2 small cakes of ink pressed into shallow wells, one black, made from soot, one red, made from ochre. Look closely and the surface of each cake is worn into a shallow dip, low in the middle and slightly higher at the edges, the exact way a bar of soap wears thin from repeated use. That small hollow was made by a wet brush, touched down again and again, thousands upon thousands of times, by a hand that has been gone for 3,000 years and left this one soft trace of its work behind. There is a habit in telling old stories of reaching for a single dramatic ending, a fall, a final battle, a curtain coming down all at once. Egypt's later centuries resist that shape. What happened instead was slower and stranger than a fall. Call it an afternoon instead, a long, gradual softening of light, in which power passed through many hands without the country itself ever quite stopping. For a time, Libyan chieftains from the western desert held the double crown, ruling as pharaohs while keeping ties to their own people beyond Egypt's border. Later, pharaohs came from the south, from the kingdom of Nubia in what is now Sudan, and among them was a king named Taharqa, said Tarechayaka. The Nubian pharaohs did something that says a great deal about how they saw themselves. Rather than treating Egypt's old customs as someone else's tradition to be managed, they observed them with unusual devotion and built pyramids of their own, hundreds of them eventually, smaller and steeper than the ones at Giza, but unmistakably kin to them, rising from the sand in Sudan today in greater numbers than Egypt itself ever built. The Persians arrived twice, ruling Egypt as a distant province of their own vast empire, and were pushed out and returned before finally giving way to someone else entirely. Alexander, a young Greek king still in his 20s, came down from the north in a conquest that, in Egypt's case, looked less like a war than an arrival. Egyptians had little love for the Persians who preceded him, and by most accounts received Alexander closer to a welcome than to resistance. He stayed only briefly, founded a new city on the coast that he modestly named for himself, Alexandria, and then moved on to the rest of his short, restless life, never to return. What Alexander left behind outlasted him by centuries. His general Ptolemy, said Tolemy, took Egypt for his own family line, and Ptolemies ruled after him for 300 years, a dynasty of Greek pharaohs who spoke Greek, married within their own family in the old royal fashion, and filled Alexandria with libraries and scholars, while upriver, the ancient temples kept their own rhythm largely undisturbed, priests still writing in the old script, still marking the flood, as if the palace by the sea belonged to a different country. In a sense, it did. The last of that line was Cleopatra, and it is worth setting aside, gently, the versions of her story built mostly around romance and ruin. What the record shows is a working monarch, fluent in several languages, involved in the day-to-day governing of her kingdom, and notably, the first of all the Ptolemies in 3 centuries to trouble herself with learning Egyptian, the language of the people she ruled. Her reign ended not in spectacle, but in the quiet, private way most lives end, and with her the line closed, and Egypt passed into the hands of Rome. Let her story close there too, softly, a door rather than a crash. Across all these centuries and all these rulers, a pattern holds that is easy to miss and worth naming plainly. Egypt did not so much resist its conquerors as absorb them. They arrived speaking other languages, worshipping other gods, wearing the dress of Libya or Nubia or Persia or Greece, and one by one they put on the double crown, took Egyptian names for their monuments, and were buried, in the end, as pharaohs among pharaohs. The river outlasted every one of them. Egypt made Egyptians of them all. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Cleopatra's death sits closer in time to yours, tonight, reading by whatever lamp you have near your bed, than it does to the workers who raised the Great Pyramid at Giza. More time passed between the pyramid and Cleopatra than has passed between Cleopatra and us. Egypt's story was already ancient, already half legend to itself, while it was still being lived and told. Most of what remains of ancient Egypt is not stone. It lives in smaller places than a pyramid. Look at a calendar on any ordinary wall, the kind with 365 days arranged in neat rows, waiting to be crossed off one at a time, and there, in its bones, sits an Egyptian invention. It began as flood arithmetic, priests and officials trying to predict, as closely as they could, when the water would rise again, and counting the days between one flood and the next, until the count came out roughly the same, year after year. Over centuries, that counting settled into a full year of 12 months, and a short handful of extra days tacked on at the end, and it traveled outward through Rome and past it, until it became simply the calendar hanging on an ordinary wall, its Egyptian beginnings long since forgotten by almost everyone who glances at it. Some words took a longer, quieter road into English, changing shape the whole way, the way a stone in a river smooths without ever quite disappearing. Ebony came down through Greek from an old Egyptian word for that dark, dense wood, prized then as now for its weight and its color. Oasis very likely made a similar journey, one small word for one small green place, a stand of palms and a spring set down in the middle of all that sand. And there is the cat. It found Egypt's grain stores first, drawn there by the mice that the grain itself attracted, and Egyptians welcomed it for the useful thing it did in the dark, then honored it, painted it, gave it a place in their households and their tombs. From those granaries along the Nile, the house cat went quietly wherever humans went next, on ships and along trade roads, until it belonged to nearly everyone in nearly every country, mostly forgetting, the way cats do, where any of this began, and mostly not minding that it's forgotten. Along the riverbanks today, not far from where the pyramids still stand, farmers grow beans and onions in soil that is, in the places it hasn't been paved over, the same black soil their families worked 100 generations ago, watered from the same river, harvested by hand in fields not so different in shape from the ones on old tomb paintings, right down to the donkey waiting at the edge of the row. The river itself rests differently now than it did for most of this story. A great dam holds it upstream, and the wild yearly flood that once climbed a field's edge like clockwork has been gentled into something calmer, stored behind concrete, released as it's needed, measured rather than watched and hoped for the way it once was. But the water still moves. It has not stopped. It passes the old stones every night, unhurried, dark, the way it always has, whether or not anyone is awake along the bank to notice it going by. On the ceilings of certain old tombs, painters once set rows of small stars against a dark blue ground, so that a person resting in that stone room forever would still have a sky above them, one that never clouded over and never needed mourning. Those are more or less the same stars turning slowly over the river tonight, over the black soil and the pale sand beside it, over whatever lamp is nearest you right now. Some things in this story held still for thousands of years. The river never did, it only ever kept moving, the whole time, underneath everything else that changed. Both of those things are true at once, which is not a bad thought to close a very long story on. That's where I'll close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.